Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to my presentation. My name is Zach Anderson. I'm a basketball player and historian here at Missouri Western State University. And today I will be presenting you the words and images that spurred the American Revolution. The American Revolutionary War will forever be ingrained in our identities as Americans, as it provides the basis of who we are as a nation. This war birthed the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, a mantra that runs through the blood of every American citizen. But however, in the years leading up to the American Revolution, not every citizen was on board to revolt against the motherland of Great Britain, as highlighted by author Harold Laswell. Many citizens of the colonial public were hesitant to revolt against the British. This factor remained true until the repeated implementation of propaganda into the American public. American leaders realized early in their dispute with their mother country that they needed to tell their side of the story quickly and effectively in order to persuade the people at home to join their side and revolt against the British. They realized that public opinion was the most important thing that mattered. And they also understood that the best way to manipulate and change public opinion is through the distribution of propaganda. Propaganda such as newspapers, articles, and visual representations of the mistreatment and abuse of American citizens by the British flooded throughout the colonies. Author Harold Laswell defines propaganda as the management of collective attitude by the manipulation of significant symbols. In the years leading up to the American Revolution, the manipulation of significant symbols and the production of propaganda was the most influential and most important factor in convincing the American public to revolt against the British. Within my presentation, I will be highlighting and analyzing multiple examples of propaganda that was produced in the years leading to the American Revolutionary War, in an effort to prove that propaganda was the most influential and powerful force that united the American citizens to come together to revolt against the British. And it is what fueled and motivated the people of America to accomplish monumental feats in the quest for American freedom. So now, before we take this journey into analyzing these pieces of propaganda, I want to make it abundantly clear to the audience what propaganda is. Propaganda can be any type of newspaper, article, or picture that forms an opinion in the eye of the viewer. In a fantastic journal article regarding American political cartoons, author Larry Bush highlights propaganda as a complex system of symbols, pictures, and images put together in a way that allows the viewer to understand the issue in front of them. So now, beginning our dive into American Revolutionary War propaganda, I want to analyze what some call the first American political cartoon, as described by author Mark Bryant. Now, before I pull this picture up, this picture originally was produced way before the American Revolution, as it was produced as a way to unite the British Americas in the French and Indian War. But why I'm highlighting this is because it provided the basis for a picture that united Americans. So this piece of propaganda can be called the snake that cannot die. It was first produced by Benjamin Franklin in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. And as I had stated, this image right here wasn't produced directly because of the American Revolution. It was produced way before. But this image, it provided a basis for what I'm going to analyze next. So before we move on, let's take a time to look at this. So you have the words join or die on it, and a snake that is broken into separate parts, with each part representing a different state. So now that it's pretty clear what this image is about, let's move into this next image. So as we can see here, so author Karen Cook highlights that on June 23rd, 1774, John Holt, the publisher of the New York Journal, revitalized and redistributed this image into the American colonies. By changing the phrases join or die, as we can see here, to unite or die, it spurred a revolution within New York. It started to make sense of why we should revolt against the British. This piece of work flooded New York, as people within the public began to realize that we need to unite against the evils of the British Empire. So as we can see here, unite or die. We need to come together. And if we look at this snake again, it's all broken up into different parts. You know, if you think of a snake, it slithers around, it's all one unit. It slithers around, wraps up its prey, and eats it. If one part of the snake dies, then the whole organism itself dies. So as we can see here, there's a couple differences in the snake. So if we look at when this image was first produced, the tail is South Carolina. But as this picture evolutionized, John Holt added Georgia as the head of the tail, or as the tail of the snake, and New England as the head of the snake. So as I was saying before, say we took Maryland off the snake, or we took Virginia off the snake would be two different sections and it would ultimately die. That's the image that John Holt was trying to get out to the American public. He was trying to highlight, if we don't all come together and form the snake to revolt against the British, then no matter what, every one of the states is gonna die. And not die in the sense of physically, as in being buried, but die in the sense of their freedoms and their hopes to govern themselves and be a separate nation from the British will die. So by John Holt revitalizing this image, it was just so smart because it showed that if we don't unite, then we will die under British rule. It really sparked the idea in the American public that, well, I think what the American leaders are saying, that we need to unite, and it sparked the idea in the colonial public that if we don't come together as one, that we will not survive under the British rule. So now that we've analyzed these first pieces of political cartoons, I now want to move into an image that's a bit more vulgar, and it's a bit more violent. But that's what made it such a great piece of propaganda. So now this next image we're going to analyze is titled, "The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Drought." Now before I give some background information and analyze this image, let's just see what's going on here. We have men holding down what seems to be a female American Indian, being choked with tea poured down her throat, held, and this guy is about to do some stuff we don't even want to talk about. We have a woman shaking her head, and men in the background looking in disgust. So now to provide some background information for this image, author Lester Olson tells us that soon after the Boston Tea Party of December 1773, Parliament issued the Intolerable Acts. And part of the Intolerable Acts was this Boston Port Bill, which closed the Boston Harbor until colonists paid for what they did during the Boston Tea Party. So now the acts are a target of this cartoon, which equates America being this unstable and weak Indian woman to the powerful force of the Briton, choking them and pouring down the tea down their throat. Now this tea is going to come back to us later, is where we analyze it, but let's look at a couple other things about when this image was first produced. So what's interesting is the Able Doctor was first produced in London. It wasn't until months after it was produced that author Paul Revere engraved this image in the month of May 1774 in the Royal American Magazine. So that's what jumped out to me really, is that this image was first published in London. A catalog in the British Museum shows that versions of the Able Doctor were published in contemporary magazines, almanacs, and broadsides, such as the London Magazine. And then it was produced in magazines in Dublin, in Boston, and in New London in Connecticut. But as I said, this image first spread throughout Europe before it even spread through the Americas. And to me, that just shows how Parliament's treatment of America was not supported by some of the people in Europe. They didn't think that America, this new colony, should be being choked and force-fed and raped. It kind of just shows how people of Britain and other European colonies were opposed to the way Parliament was treating the colonies. So now Lester Olson describes this image as Britain and America resisting rape, as they're being choked, held down, and like we analyzed before, about to be raped. But what's interesting to hear is that he's pouring tea down the American throat. Now, it's tea in the image, but what this image is really showing that Britain, and the strength of the Britain government, is force-feeding these taxes, these bills, and these unjust way of life into the American colonies. And it's unright, as we could see by this woman who represents she can represent people in the Americas, or she can even represent people in Europe, looking in disgust as what British is doing to the Americas. So it's just, this piece of propaganda is a great example of how propaganda was not only used in the colonies, but it was also used in the motherland of Britain and Europe. It just goes to show how the visual consumption of propaganda can revolt people around a cause. Because think, you're an American in the American public. Say you're in the colony of New York, and you're walking around, you're doing your thing, you're living your life with your family. Then you get a newspaper with this image in it, and you see that we're being represented as an American Indian about to be raped with tea, but that's not tea, that's the taxes and bills being forced down our throat. That's no way to live. You would want to oppose this and be against this, and you would want to join around with the common cause of revolution. That's what made this image and this piece of propaganda so great, is because it showed how violent and how the strength of the Britain Parliament was treating the helpless people of the Americas. It caused people to revolt, and as we've highlighted before, it caused people to unite and be angry at the British. And this is really what started the rolling ball of the American Revolution. So now, this image produced not only the uniting of the American public, it also was a direct cause for the First Continental Congress to meet in September 1774 to discuss how best to unite and oppose the rule of the British. This is highlighted by author Arthur Schlesinger. So this just shows how this visual consumption of the propaganda united the American public and caused the first meeting of the First Continental Congress, which, as I said, started the rolling ball of the American Revolution. So now I'm going to move on to our last visual representation. And this representation is probably one of the most popular and most known pieces of propaganda even today. And this piece of propaganda is titled the Boston Massacre, or the Bloody Massacre. So now this next image of propaganda is arguably some of the most interesting pieces of propaganda, just because when it came out at this time, there was a discrepancy between what actually happened and what was highlighted in this piece of propaganda. But as I said in my introduction, propaganda doesn't always have to be exactly what happened. The American leaders, such as Paul Revere, used propaganda as a way to unite the American citizens by not necessarily showing a lie, but titling their version of history, titling their version of the event in order to unite the public so we can unite against the British throughout our journey for American freedom. So now let's take a look at this piece of propaganda. The Bloody Massacre. As we can see, it highlights a squadron of British soldiers shooting against the helpless Americans that in this image, it just seems that they're doing nothing. They're just minding their own business. Just to get gunned down by some soldiers? But let's see, because as I've said, this image is not actually what happened. So now, to fully understand the importance of this piece of propaganda, you have to understand the events that led up to that incident. In her article, The Paul Revere Print of the Boston Massacre, Louis Kellogg illustrates that after the successful resistance of the Stamp Act by the colonists, Britain Parliament ordered 4 regiments of British troops to be quartered in Boston. Now, upon their arrival and implementation into the public space of Boston, colonists did not enjoy living beside them. Because as Kellogg states in her article, the more people, when they came, they had to fight for jobs. So these soldiers were taking jobs from the colonial public. And I don't know about you, but if someone comes in who's not even a citizen and they're taking my money that I'm providing for my family, that's gonna make me mad. So the tension that arises from the British soldiers taking the jobs of the American colonists caused tension between the public and the British troops, until finally the public of Boston had had enough. In the article, Rival Truths, Political Accommodation, and the Boston Massacre, author Neil York tells the story of what happened on the night of March 5th, 1770. So after an argument between Boston colonists and a group of British soldiers escalated, the British soldiers opened fire upon the colonists, killing 5 men and injuring several others. But what York highlights is that it's different from this image, because colonists started throwing rocks and started physically attacking these soldiers. And in response, the soldiers fired back as a way to protect themselves. So after this incident, the events that actually happened were received as a justified response by the colonists that were there. As all 8 soldiers that went on trial were not found guilty of murder, but only 2 of the soldiers were found guilty of manslaughter. But however, as I said in my introduction to this, what actually happened and what is highlighted in this is what makes propaganda so great. Because it doesn't matter what actually happened. What matters is what you can produce and show to manipulate and choose what you want the American public to see. And Paul Revere understood that, because Paul Revere used these events that took place in the massacre and put a spin on them to change the public opinion in favor to revolt against the British. So let's analyze this image a little bit more. So as we can see, it depicts the colonists as doing nothing wrong. But as I had showed before, it was actually the colonists who started this incident. And as we can see, the British soldiers are in a line shooting against the colonists. But that's not what Paul Revere wanted to produce. Paul Revere produced it as they're being ordered and fired to shoot against the colonists, while in reality, they were just fighting for their lives. Another great thing about this image is that there's a dog. Now, no one really knows if there's a dog there or not, but the importance of this dog is that it shows, when you think of dogs, I'm not saying you think of America as whole, I'm not saying dogs equals America, but what you do think of is if you think of home. Dogs symbolize home because they symbolize your companionship. And that's what Paul Revere wanted to get out. They wanted to get out that the Britain soldiers are attacking our home. They're attacking our freedoms. They're attacking our little dogs. And that's what's so great about the production of this image. Because again, it just shows how the visual consumption of propaganda can manipulate the public opinion. So now, Paul Revere's image was not the only piece of propaganda that spurred from this event. According to Francis Wallet in his article, James Bowdoin, Patriot Propagandist, the events that occurred in the Boston Massacre produced a piece of propaganda that was one of the strongest attacks on British policy. In response to the Boston Massacre, officials within Boston organized a meeting to produce a piece of propaganda. Now this piece is our first representation of something other than a visual propaganda. This propaganda was titled A Short Narrative of the Horrid Massacre in Boston. Now James Bowdoin, who's this propagandist, was tasked with the job of putting together this short narrative to convince Americans in the other colonies that this massacre was an event of British brutality. Now let me read you an excerpt from this narrative. This excerpt shows how the British soldiers look at the colonists as nothing but below them. This narrative gave colonists the view that military occupation of Boston created universal uneasiness, and abusive and insolent treatment of citizens led Bostonians to believe that the troops were not sent here for any benefit of the province. So now, let me read you this excerpt. So the soldiers, ever since the fatal day of their arrival, have treated us with an insolence which discovered in them an early prejudice against us, as being that rebellious people which our implacable enemies had maliciously represented us to be. They landed in the town with all the appearance of hostility. They marched through the town with all signs of triumph, and evidently designed to subject the inhabitants to the severe discipline of a garrison. Now, James Bowdoin worded this so perfectly because it just shows how these soldiers came in with nothing but a prejudice against us, taking our jobs. And as we can see in the Boston Massacre, or at least the truth of the Boston Massacre that Paul Revere distributed, that these soldiers are killing us. They look at us as below them. And this just, it united the colonists because it made them realize again, why should we stay under British control? All they want to do is torture us and kill us and just not let us live our lives. It just shows that this piece of propaganda, these two pieces that were produced from the Boston Massacre, from this short narrative to this image, it just shows how these colonial leaders use the images and their versions of the images to unite the people of the Americas. It showed that propaganda is the most influential thing when it comes to forming the public opinion. because the public opinion is how you change something. And what they wanted to change was the way we were being treated by the British. They understood that the only way for us to survive is if we have our own government, under our own rule. So now, moving on from the propaganda produced by the Boston Massacre, I want to now analyze a pamphlet that changed the course of the revolution as we know it. So as I have now showed you the short narrative in pictures of propaganda, I now want to highlight a pamphlet that is one of the most brilliant pamphlets ever written in the English language, as author Robert Ferguson cites. A pamphlet that the first president, George Washington, even stated was an undeniable piece of work, highlighted by Sophia Rosenfeld in her article. This pamphlet, titled Common Sense, it was published by Thomas Paine on January 10th, 1776. This work spread quickly through the colonies, as 120 to 150,000 copies were said to have been distributed throughout the colonies within the first 3 months, cites Lee Singleman in his work, The Common Style of Common Sense. This pamphlet was a 47-page piece advocating independence for Britain to the people of the 13 colonies. What made this pamphlet have such an impact on the colonists' desire for a national identity was that it was written with just this elegant verbiage and this persuasive pose. As colonial common folk read this piece of work, it sparked a flame inside them that resonated with their beliefs that they should be free of the Parliament rule and be governed by their own sets of rules and ways of life. Paine wrote this pamphlet in such a way that it appealed to so many people, either the rich and even the lesser, some who could read great and some who were barely literate, others who even had to have the pamphlet read to them, states Jack Fruchtman. This pamphlet was written with a language that it appealed to everyone. It appealed to our nature, and it appealed to our nature to be opposed to the British, and to our nature that we need to declare our own identity. These ideas resonated with the citizens on every spectrum in the colonial public. As I now read you this excerpt, put your mind in the colonial public again. As I read you this excerpt, think, what would you do in this situation after reading this such persuasive and elegant piece? So many circumstances have and will arise, which are not local, but universal, and through which the principles of all lovers of mankind are affected, and in the event of which their affections are interested. The laying a country desolate with fire and sword, declaring war against the natural rights of all mankind, and extirpating the defenders thereof from the face of the earth is the concern of every man to whom nature hath given the power of feeling. What is very intriguing about this excerpt is how Paine uses the language of rights of all mankind, when in reality, he is just talking about the rights of the 13 colonies. By doing this, Paine is isolating the idea that colonists should revolt and unite against Great Britain. And Great Britain should be looked at as nothing but a villain that's treating colonists inhumanely through unnecessary taxation, unjust bills, and unjust taxation without representation. This specific language not only united the people in the colonies, but it also made them feel as if Britain should be opposed by the rest of the world. As Paine used the verbiage of mankind, referring to the human population. This feeling, the feeling they get from this pamphlet, is what gives colonists the confidence that if we do revolt against the superiority of the British, they will have the support of the world, of the other European countries. The specific language and savvy persuasion that Thomas Paine used in Common Sense is the reason this pamphlet is one of the greatest and most influential pieces in American propaganda history. So I have now showed you multiple images, pamphlets, and excerpts from different pieces of propaganda throughout different pieces of time, all leading up to the American Revolutionary War. I hope you all understand how it's the images that produce feelings and emotion, those feelings and emotions coming from propaganda, that really led the American public to all follow a cause. As author Ben Irvin tells us that in order to influence a group of people to follow a cause, you have to control and manipulate the public opinion to agree with that cause. And the greatest way of manipulating public opinion is through the distribution and implementation of propaganda into their daily lives. Propagandists such as James Bowdoin and Paul Revere understood that assignment. They understood that public opinion is the most influential factor when it comes to agreeing with their cause. That cause being to revolt against the British and create our own national identity. As we can see here, we would not have gotten this image, the American flag, what represents our identity, our nation, and our own way of life. We would not have gotten the American flag and everything that's great about our nation without the influence propaganda had on public opinion. This just goes to show that propaganda, whether in the form of newspapers, images, or pamphlets, was the most influential factor that united the American public to revolt against the British, and what led them to have confidence that they could have a war against Britain and win, all in order to produce this American flag and our heart of a nation. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to come to my presentation. May God bless America, and may God bless the rest of your days. Thank you.